Much, Ted, and welcome everyone to this session of the Weatherhead Forum, which, as many of you know, showcases the research and debates of the various units and affiliates of the Weatherhead Center of International Affairs. And today's session features our Weatherhead Scholars Program with a really important topic: building better lives, crises, inequalities, and social change. And as Ted mentioned, I'm Melanie Cammett. I'm the director of the Weatherhead Center. I'm also a professor in the government department at Harvard. I'm going to briefly introduce the Weatherhead Scholars Program and the chair of today's session. So the Weatherhead Scholars Program, which used to be called the Weatherhead Fellows Program, welcomed its first class of participants in 2017 to 2018. The program offers visiting faculty, postdoctoral researchers, and experienced practitioners the opportunity to spend up to 1 year at Harvard conducting comparative international research. During their time in residence, the scholars participate in the biweekly Weatherhead Forum and in the program's biweekly scholars seminar, and also contribute to the many other intellectual activities available at the center, including the research cluster programs. Many of the visiting scholars tell me there is actually too much to participate in, so they have to use their time wisely, balancing between their own work and attending the exciting events at the center. We're also very grateful that the visiting scholars engage with our undergraduate and graduate student community. So this is a very important program to the core of the Weatherhead Center, and we're really delighted to have all these world-class researchers here with us. I also want to introduce Erin Goodman, who's the director of the Weatherhead Scholars Program. In fact, Erin has just completed 1 year with us, and it's been an amazing year. We are really privileged to have her amongst us. She, of course, comes to the Weatherhead Center with a wealth of experience, both in the nonprofit sector and having previously worked at Harvard for 15 years at the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies. She also has her own accomplished side career as a translator and specialist in Spanish language literature. So she's a woman of many hats. I look forward to hearing about the really exciting research that our scholars have been conducting, and I'm going to turn the floor over to Erin. Thank you.
Thanks, Melanie. So my job today is to introduce the topic of the forum and our panelists, and I'll try to do so as quickly as possible so that we can get to the substance of today's presentation. So our overarching topic today with these 4 panelists from the Weatherhead Scholars Program is how and under what circumstances we can transform negative events, generational or youth anger, and social unrest into action for future change. As the question mark in the title might indicate, building better lives, question mark, the panelists today may be cautious about being overly optimistic. So although we're not here to talk about Ukraine and Russia today, it's worth considering how what we'll learn may or may not apply to the current conflict. Today, we're going to cover a different and wide geographic range, from neighborhoods in the US to cities in Europe, Asia, and South America. On the international level, we'll look at different countries' interpretations of universal events, such as the current pandemic and climate change. So I'll briefly introduce today's speakers in the order that they'll present, and then we'll go right into the presentations, holding questions for the end of the session, although you're more than welcome to type them into the chat as they occur to you. So as I mentioned, all 4 are participants in the Weatherhead Scholars Program, and coincidentally, they're also members of the research cluster on comparative inequality and inclusion. So in the order of appearance, Ioana Sendroiu is the Dorman Memorial Postdoctoral Fellow working on crisis politics. In the fall, she'll join the University of Hong Kong as an assistant professor of sociology. She's particularly interested in how we decide or contest being in crisis and the reactions resulting from such decisions. Ioana holds a PhD in sociology from the University of Toronto and has been a senior research fellow at the Max Planck Institute for Research on Collective Goods and a teaching fellow on global perspectives on society at NYU Shanghai. Cécile van der Velde is a visiting scholar and a professor in the sociology department at the University of Montreal, where she holds the Canada Research Chair in Social Inequalities and Life course. Cécile earned her PhD in sociology at Sciences Po, and she has taught at the University of Lille and at the EHESS, and has received multiple awards, including the French National Merit Order in 2015. This year, she's working on a book about the rise of social anger within younger generations around the world, based on comparative research conducted in Canada, Chile, France, Spain, and Hong Kong. And I'd like to thank Cécile for taking the lead on today's panel. Poulomi Chakrabarti is a visiting scholar and an assistant professor in the Department of Political Studies at Queen's University in Canada. She examines the effects of social status on redistribution and public goods provision in multi-ethnic societies. Poulomi holds a master's degree in international development from MIT and a PhD in political science from Brown. This year, she's been working on her book manuscript on how caste has been instrumental in shaping the distinct development trajectories of Indian states in the last century. And last but not least, Thijs van Dormalen is an associate of the Weatherhead Scholars Program and holds a PhD in sociology from the University of Amsterdam. He's been a lecturer in political science at Leiden University. During his time here at Harvard, he's been working on a manuscript on the framing of 9/11 in the American, French, and Dutch public spheres, as well as applying the ideas and methodology he developed in his dissertation to new event cases, such as the COVID-19 pandemic and the climate crisis. So with that, I'd like to begin the presentations with Ioana.
Thank you. And thank you so much, Erin, for all of your hard work in organizing this. So let me share. Okay. So I have the daunting privilege to set the terms of the conversation today. As Erin said, we're interested in how events turn into action for social change. And we're generally interested, I think, in how people have dreams, big dreams for themselves and for their lives, and how they can come up with these ideas for a better life, what they do when these ideas are threatened or in crisis, or indeed what they do when they simply can't achieve the better lives that they had hoped for. I incidentally had a bookmark like that when I was younger, though mine was frankly cooler because it had stars and beads and things. But it's a narrative that I think you'll all recognize that's pervasive in our lives. It's an exhortation to dream big. And I think what's crucial here, what's important, is that it assures you that you'll achieve no matter what, that as long as you dream big, as long as you keep going, you'll achieve, even if you miss the moon, you land among the stars. It's also a narrative that I would argue is damaging to the less advantaged among us. And so Erin said that we're not perhaps going to be not overly optimistic. And in fact, in a way, my findings are quite pessimistic. My talk, or rather the big finding in one sentence, is that in low quality neighborhoods, individuals with high expectations actually experience depreciated life course outcomes. Now, this is actually far from the consensus in the existing literature, which frankly, I think hews closer to the dream big exhortations we hear in our everyday daily lives. In sociology, views of the future are embedded within our dominant conceptualization of agency. That's basically constituted somewhere between past, present, and future. And so the basic idea is that agency and any action is future-oriented. And so research has detailed the many ways in which high hopes for the future are highly motivating and they're effectively protective over the life course. So the idea is that being hopeful keeps you going when times are tough. And in fact, in sociology, at least, the consensus in favor of hopefulness is so strong that research argues that being hopeful has few downsides. Reynolds and Baird, in a seminal piece, argue that a failure to achieve what is expected has little detrimental effect. So they find no relationship between youth's unrealized educational expectations and their mental health. So they elaborate a theory of what they call adaptive resilience to account for this. So they argue that having high hopes is empowering, but people can effectively get over it if they don't achieve what they wanted to achieve. This isn't quite what I find in my research to date. In a paper that just came out at Social Psychology Quarterly, my co-authors and I used a longitudinal study of US lawyers' careers to look at different types of future orientations. So we looked at how much lawyers would like to make partner, so that would be aspirations, and how strongly they expected to make partner, so expectations. And what we find is that high future expectations are actually harmful if goals aren't achieved. So we find that dashed expectations of making partner are associated with depression, but that there's no such effect for more pie in the sky aspirations. So here we see some evidence that dashed hopes can actually be harmful, at least when we look at future expectations among professionals who are committed to a career rather than youth, as in the original Reynolds and Baird study. Now, I should note that it's not just sociologists who are keen on hopefulness. Economists take it even further. They link future orientations to economic development. This is partly inspired by our anthropologist Arjun Appadurai's work on capacities to aspire. He thinks that the capacity to aspire, he thinks of it as a sort of an ability that's both individual and collective. And he argues that these capacities to aspire are actually central to economic mobility. So aspirations in this way are centrally linked to achievement. And what's powerful, I think, about this line of work is that it not only thinks about the outcomes of hopefulness, as the sociologists do, but also roots that hopefulness in inequality. So in that sense, an aspirations gap is actually thought about as a poverty trap. The idea is that over the life course, poverty and deprivation limit individuals' hopes. And the result is that these individuals will not aspire to their full potential. So it's a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Low aspirations lead to low effort, which then reinforce low aspirations and so on. And I should note that this line of research has also inspired policy interventions, for instance, by the World Bank to increase aspirations as a way to decrease poverty. So altogether, behavioral economists see future orientations as contextually dependent. And I think that's exactly right. What we hope for is rooted in the resources that we have available. But my point here is that if we start paying attention to context, then it also follows that the outcomes of our hopes, whether we can actualize them, that's also context dependent. And there's, of course, a very large body of research that relates achievement or well-being to neighborhood contexts. For instance, in work of mine that just came out at Social Forces, my co-authors and I look at hundreds of towns in Central and Eastern Europe, and we find that Roma respondents who live in more disadvantaged contexts are more likely to avoid helpful institutions. So this, as a sort of cultural process, we think helps reproduce durable inequality. And the findings in a way are old in sociology, that contexts are central for well-being. Now, I would argue that work like this, where we contextualize well-being, it implies that in poor quality neighborhoods, individuals will lack the resources to actualize their high expectations, even if they do start having these high expectations. And I think that this has important implications both conceptually and for policy. What Laura Yupanex and I argue in the paper that I'm sharing today is that increasing aspirations is a very risky strategy. So we effectively track the detrimental life course effects of a gap between future expectations and the resources needed to achieve them. And what we find is that, as I said before, in low quality neighborhoods, individuals with high expectations experience depreciated life course outcomes. So how do we do this? We used MIDAS, the National Survey of Midlife Development in the US, and we looked longitudinally, tracking people over 20 years using hybrid fixed effects models. We operationalized future expectations through the question, looking ahead 10 years into the future, what do you expect your life overall will be like at that time? And then we tracked the outcomes of these future orientations across 4 dependent variables. So we looked at income, mortality, life satisfaction, and depression. All of this, of course, as I said, across different types of neighborhoods. We used a measure of subjective neighborhood quality that includes items such as feeling safe in the neighborhood or trust and support in the neighborhood. And we made all of that into a scale. One important thing to note regarding this neighborhood measure is that the findings hold when we control for objective neighborhood SES based on information from the US Census. And then we controlled for standard demographics, self-rated health. We also controlled for mastery and optimism. Happy to talk about this more, but we thought that those could also influence expectations for the future. And then we also included some measures of personal finances. So what are the findings? What you're looking at is a simplified results table predicting income over the life course. So all of these models have the range of controls that I already mentioned. So controlling for all of those, we see that future expectations affect income both on average and as they change over the life course. That's model 1 here. And then we see that this holds when controlling for mastery in model 2. And then in model 3, what's fairly interesting is that on its own, neighborhood quality here isn't a significant predictor of income when we control for everything else. But then what you see in model 4 is a significant interaction between neighborhood quality and future expectations when we're predicting income. This is actually what it looks like if we plot out the interaction. And I think it's just incredibly stark. So on the right, we have high quality neighborhoods here. In the middle, we have moderate quality neighborhoods. And on the left, we have low quality neighborhoods. And what we see is that high expectations are great. They're really helpful in high quality neighborhoods here. So in these places, higher expectations are associated with significantly higher incomes over the life course. But it turns out that they're very damaging in low quality neighborhoods. So here we actually see that individuals are penalized for having high expectations. So the pattern flips. And the findings, I should note, hold across all of our dependent variables. We see the same interaction for life satisfaction. We see it for depression using the Kessler-6 index. And most worryingly, I would say we see it even for mortality using Cox proportional hazard models. So the big takeaways we think are 2. First, that folks need realistic expectations. And second, that higher expectations need to be matched by the context-dependent resources needed to achieve them. So thank you, and I look forward to your questions and feedback.
Thank you. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So thank you very much. So I'm following the flow. I'm Cécile van de Velde. I'm very happy to present alongside my colleagues and friends from the Weatherhead Scholars Program. So Ioana spoke of hope and the price of hope. And I'm going to deal with another type of social emotion, of social energy, that is the revolt or the social anger. It is about the struggle to build better lives carried out by younger generations these past years. So today I will draw on the comparison of different youth protests around the world to explore what they express. And I will show the rise of the global generational voice saying, "What have you done to our world?" So many things have happened in the last 2 years, so we may have forgotten how young people were protesting all around the world for various causes, are still in some places. These waves of protest went from Arab Springs, Indignados, to more recently Friday for Futures movements. To some extent, these waves were compared to the 68 movements because of this strong generational dimension, even if, of course, the roots and the causes are not the same. And I have studied, and I've been on 7 of these youth protests. 2 student movements, the Printemps Arabe in Montreal and the student movement in Santiago de Chile at the beginning of the last decade. 2 European anti-austerity and indignation movements, the Indignados in Madrid and the Nuit Debout movement in Paris. 2 pro-democratic movements in Hong Kong, the Umbrella Revolution in 2014 and the pro-democratic movement in 2019, and 1 pro-climate march in the Friday for Future movement that took place in Montreal just before the pandemic. Oh, sorry. So my main question was to identify the generational voices. So to change the focus from who is there to what is said in the protest. So I decided to work on the slogans and the protest writings in order to identify if there were global patterns in these generational narratives. My aim was to compare the generational grievances, the emotions, the identities, and the visions of future expressed in these protests. The collection took place by direct observation, and I took into account the greatest possible diversity of slogans, whether collective or individual, printed or handwritten, and appearing on placards, posters, or walls. What it actually means is that I was in the protest, taking pictures of as many slogans that I could, and even sometimes running away from police. I gathered around 2,000 slogans, which were then translated into English, put in a database, which allowed me to set up a textual and statistical analysis mixed with a qualitative analysis. So in the remaining time, I'd like to give you some glimpses of the findings. So this cloud of words comes out from a textual analysis on all the slogans. So the bigger the words, the more frequent they are. There would be a lot to say, but sociologically, two things. First, if you look at the main words, education, democracy, person, you can see also love, freedom, planet. You can see that the main demands refer to strong and long-term value, to strong societal values. To put it simply, they are more pro-movements than anti-movements. And secondly, we can underline its generational character. The slogans are marked by the presence of us, mainly associated with the words. You can see them in the circle: student, youth, young people, so more juvenile and student identities, even if you find other identities like people or local identities. Let's now see the breakup of this big cloud to build a cloud for each protest. And this is what comes out. The takeaway is that we have classes of protests sharing almost the same words, the values, or even almost the same slogans. I'll come back to this a little later. Now, let's take a look at the proper material. This is a selection of pictures aimed at illustrating a profound common pattern in all the protests. It's a matter of life and death. It's considered a matter of life and death. And this comes out everywhere. You can see, let's keep in mind that it was before the pandemic. So you can see people either smothered because the debt and financial pressure in the student movements in the liberal countries. You can see people drawing themselves animalized or dehumanized in European movement because of precarity. You can see people jeopardized by police in Hong Kong movements, or you can see slogans about being collectively burned or drowned in the pro-climate movement. And this goes with a rhetoric of dispossession and deprivation. In the slogans, this threat justify a leap to regain power over the individual and collective lives. And it is what is fundamentally at stake here. It gives meanings to the great and long-standing values that the textual analysis brought to light. Another global pattern that we can find in the slogans is a strong split and a global split between us and them. Everywhere you find the fundamental opposition between us and them. For example, they will not control us, we will be victorious, they do not represent us. And the fact, you can see the fact that the them is never really defined. Analysis shows that the them refers to multiple figures, in particular a triad: politicians, banks, and media. But none of them embody power on their own. What is difficult in the contemporary revolts is to name and to target a real opponent. So there is a resort to an undefined opponent, which is a system or a them. what is emerging is the condemnation of older generations. And there is a build-up throughout the decade of a strong generational narrative. In all the movements, there is a criticism of a legacy, whether economic, social, political, or environmental, that is considered a too heavy burden and that has been unfairly passed on younger generation. I won't read out loud the slogan, but it bears a strong need for hope, and there is an anger against an identified and guilty party. So I won't have time to elaborate, but of course, you have different generational narratives according to the types of movements and according to the countries where they take place. So each system has its bits, and the generational narratives reflect that. With a narrative of a generation under threat and under financial pressure, more dominant in liberal welfare regimes, focusing more on economic inequalities between generations, but where you can find a hope, still a hope, and direct relationships to governments. You can find a narrative of sacrificed generation in the European context, focusing more on social inequalities of generation and bearing a more radical and systemic will for change. We have in the pro-democratic movement in Hong Kong a dominant narrative of a betrayed generation. So here it's more about the political injustice between generations. And finally, a narrative of a condemned generation in the pro-climate movement, focusing more on existential dimensions in terms of both quality and quantity of life. What you can see is that the intergenerational inequalities discourse has amplified and strengthened throughout the decade. First, on specific dimensions linked to the crisis and a reaction to the crisis, so economic, social, politics, and then with the Fridays for Future movement, making the junction between all these dimensions. Compared to other movements, the pro-climate rhetoric marks a double shift. First, it relies on a strong generational we, but asserted at the global level, even if we have to keep in mind that it is claimed primarily by young, educated, and urban generations. And it also reveals an increasingly direct accusation of the older generations. If you look at the slogans, you can even see a new phenomenon of inversion of the transmission of generations. For example, we are skipping our lessons to teach you one. Do you see the power of young people? It's a phenomenon first shown by Margaret Mead in the end of the 60s. And you can see the growing idea now that the change can only come from younger generations. We now know that the pandemic has been especially tough on the young generations in terms not only on jobs, but also on mental health. And statistics show an increasing pessimism and defiance among younger people. So it will be interesting to see how the rhetoric evolves in the wake of the pandemic. From our recent interviews in Canada, in Quebec and Ontario, we can think it will accelerate the empowerment and the call for social change. But there is also, among the most precarious ones, a potential radicalization of anger. Thank you for listening.
Can you see this? Great. So I'm going to start where Cécile left off, and she was talking about movements that are intergenerational, but the other form of movements that we are observing all around us, and which is a bit of a strange paradox, because income inequality has been increasing, over the last decades, and the dominant form of social movements that we see are identity-based, right? So this has puzzled leftist scholars. This has puzzled, I mean, if Marx was alive, he would be having nightmares. So how do we explain this? Building off on the presentations that we've just heard, I argue that what we really need to think about is not just income inequality, but also status. So status as compared to, say, the Marxian idea of class, status refers to collective ranking of groups. So this is based on ideas of honor or of respect or of recognition. And the idea of status is quite new in political science, but scholars in psychology as well as sociology have been studying it for quite a long time. And it has been shown to be an independent effect, to have an independent effect on income inequality, what has been referred as durable inequality. So one way to conceptualize status would be to think about ranked versus unranked societies, right? So an unranked social system and an unranked ethnic system would be a society where two ethnic groups are not segregated by class, right? So they have similar levels of income, they have some similar levels of social class. And a ranked system in contrast would be one where due to, say, legacies of slavery or colonialism or caste, ethnic groups are segregated by social class. And what differentiates them would be also social status, right? So to think about it in a slightly different and slightly more conceptual way would be to map them on an axis of income inequality and status inequality, right? So you can have groups like, say, English-speaking Canadians and French-speaking Canadians on the left quadrant, which would be an unranked system, which is how we understand multi-ethnic societies and how we understand the politics of recognition. And on the other end of the spectrum, which would be ranked societies like, say, India or United States with histories of slavery. And this is not just important to understand how different societies are structured, but it might also be very useful to understand how political mobilizations take place. So a lot of the movements now on the right are also based on identity. They're also based on status. So we can think about, elite backlash, for example, Brexit, or the Trump presidency recently as a politics of dominance, right? And the basic idea here is that as individuals, as groups, we're not just motivated by material concerns, but we're also motivated by status, right? And sometimes concerns of status are even more important than material goods like, public services or income or taxation. So I would conceptualize movements on the right that are led by dominant groups and these groups are trying to preserve their ascriptive privilege as the politics of dominance, right? So, and this is not just in the Western world where we have now been talking about, these right-wing populism. This has also been observed in countries like India, in Brazil, with the rise of Modi, for example, which some have argued is a backlash against mobilizations by marginal groups. And at the other end of the spectrum, what has been understood as mobilization by low status groups can be conceptualized as politics of dignity. And here, what I mean by dignity is equalization of social status. And so they're fighting for equal rights. They're fighting for the ability to be respected, to not be humiliated. So what is really differentiating ranked societies from unranked societies is the idea of humiliation, which is quite different from material deprivation, right? So here we could think about movements by indigenous groups in Latin America or even in North America. We can think about the Black Lives Matter movement, for example, and the caste-based mobilizations in South Asia and other parts of Asia which are also segregated by rank and status, right? So the way that the politics of dignity manifests itself, unlike workers' movements or unlike class-based movements, is not just for demands for redistribution, but it's related to demands for representation. And this can take two different forms. The first form would be symbolic representation. So like, for example, in the American South, recently, there have been all these protests about removing the Confederate monuments, right? In the Indian case, this is a statue of one of the chief ministers in the northern states of Uttar Pradesh, where you see a statue of her being inaugurated by her. She's a Dalit, the first Dalit chief minister in India. And it seems kind of mad to be able to spend so much money on things like that are just symbols, on things like statues. But look at the picture right below, which is a picture of one of the most prominent Dalit leaders called Ambedkar, which has to be protected from upper caste villagers because of elite backlash, right? So these symbols are not just something that is immaterial. It's not just because of psychic rewards, but it's also something that has a huge benefit for people who are especially at the bottom of the society, right? But more concretely, what these movements have really been pushing for is descriptive representation in the bureaucracy. And by descriptive representation, I mean the extent to which representatives resemble the identity of those that are being represented. So you can think about it in terms of the ethnic identities of, say, the bureaucracy, the judiciary, in terms of either gender or caste or racial identities. And it matters because the extent to which people from marginal groups see themselves reflected in institutions of power matter very much for belonging, right? So the picture below is a picture of lower caste groups demanding reservations in higher education and the bureaucracy. So the most of my own research focuses on India and how are these demands for representation really understood. So globally, we see a lot of support for marginal groups coming into positions of power. Politically, we think of that as decolonization. We think of that as democratization. But when these groups demand representation in the bureaucracy, that's generally understood as patronage, right? Like you want your own people in positions of power so that you can extend your patronage network, so that you can maybe benefit from the state and even loot the state. Scholars have called this neo-patrimonialism. Some have even called it the politics of retribution, right? So this is a picture of one of the chief ministers of the state of Bihar. When he came to power, he famously said, we need dignity, not development, right? So, and this is a sentiment that's quite widely shared, that a representation in the bureaucracy in the form of affirmative action is anti-merit. You want the best and the brightest to be able to work on the bureaucracy. And these are pictures of protests generally by upper caste groups. And what is very interesting about these movements is everywhere, not just in India, it's always about the murder of merit, right? So we think of that as deteriorating the quality of governance, deteriorating the quality of government personnel. So what I try and do in my research is try and understand whether this sort of representation actually makes a difference in development, whether is it just symbolic, is it just something that we think about in terms of psychological benefits. And what to understand that more concretely, what I look at is the kind of redistributive spending that has been taking place in Indian states from 1960 to now. So basically like more than 5 decades of public spending at the state level. And I focus on the state level because most of the social spending and as well as economic spending, the decisions for those are made at state level and not at the federal level. And the main variables that I'm interested in is the caste representation of the people who are in the government, of the legislators and state governments, as well as the caste-based reservations that they've been demanding in the bureaucracy. So the actual reservations that have been enacted through different government policies. And if there's time, we can talk about like some of the controls that I've used and the methods. So what I find is that states with a higher level of political representation by lower caste groups, as well as higher levels of reservations, are more redistributive. And they're not just more redistributive in this proportion of spending that goes into social sectors, but they're also more redistributive in the total amount of money that goes in sectors like health and education. What is interesting is that political representation by itself doesn't seem to make a difference. So states with a higher proportion of upper castes in the government are less redistributive, which is quite, it aligns quite well with what we understand about elite politics, that economic elite would not support redistribution. They would want lower taxes. But unlike the working classes, the lower caste legislators don't seem to be supporting redistribution, which seems, one way to think about it is that maybe their priorities are misaligned. Maybe once they come to power, they want to loot the state, which is what the current scholarship has argued. But this is something that's not unique to India. So in indigenous parties in Latin America, for example, and they've been in power for a while, scholars have found that they've been quite successful at promoting representation in bureaucracies and other state institutions, but they've had very limited success in radical redistribution. And this is similar to what we find in the civil rights movements in the US. And most studies of representation, descriptive representation, has focused on the political part of the state. But most of the state, as we know, is the bureaucracy, right? So if the bureaucracy is generally occupied by positions of people from dominant groups, maybe they have their own biases, maybe they have their own patronage networks that are connected to local elites. There could be a number of reasons why the people who are in the bureaucracy also affect development outcomes, because ultimately most of the implementation of government programs is not done by political representatives, it's done by the bureaucracy, right? So to go back to our original question about building better lives, so what I'm arguing in my work is that we need to push back against scholars who have thought about the bureaucracy and representation in the bureaucracy purely in terms of patronage or in terms of retribution, but rather look at descriptive representation more completely and focus on both the political side of the state as well as the bureaucratic part of the state, right? So I'll stop here and I'm happy to talk about methods and questions later.
Okay. Does it work like this? Yeah? Okay, so thank you so much. I will try to be brief so that we will have enough time for some discussion. So I'm going to talk about how different national contexts lead to different types of reactions to foreign events or crises. And I'm going to apply this to the case of the Netherlands and France. And I have to disappoint you if you think that I'm going to talk about the Ukraine crisis. I didn't have time yet to implement this in my research, but I think the results I get my hypothesis would be that they also apply to the Ukraine crisis. So I'm interested in the question, how do people, countries relate to foreign events or crises? And this is with increasing processes of globalization, which lead to increasing interconnectedness around the world. An important question, it leads to, as Luc Boltanski, the French sociologist Luc Boltanski has said, processes of distant suffering. So we do not only care about our own lives or the lives of the people whom we live in our neighborhood or in our country, but we care about the lives of people far away. We care about the people in Ukraine at the moment. So the question that I want to answer is, to what extent and why are foreign events domesticated? And domestication means that the event is not seen as something that is far away or distant or foreign, but it becomes important for the domestic affairs of people living in a certain country. And I will compare France and the Netherlands here. And I compare them because they make for an interesting comparison. First of all, there are big versus small countries. So culturally, economically, politically, France is more powerful. As a Dutch guy, I have to admit this. On the other hand, the Netherlands and France share a lot of similarities. They're both part of the same culture, let's say Western or European culture. They share a lot of international alliances. So you could say on the one hand, they have things in common. On the other hand, they don't have things in common, which makes for an interesting comparison to see how does domestication play out in these two different country contexts. And I compare 4 21st century events: 9/11, the tsunami in Southeast Asia of 2004, the Arab Spring, and the Trump election. So these are all events which happened beyond the borders of these two countries. And the method that I use is topic modeling. I won't go into detail here. The topic modeling means that you can use, that you can analyze big amounts of data, of text data, and look for rows of words that often show up together, which are called topics. These are topics of the Dutch newspapers about the Trump election. I'm not sure how many of you read Dutch, but it's quite obvious that, for instance, the topic 3 is about Russia and America and Clinton and Obama. So it has something to do with the United States and foreign affairs. And I use topic modeling to analyze newspaper articles, and I hope to measure public elite, so politicians, journalists, intellectuals, by looking at newspaper articles. So I compare newspaper articles from these two countries, and these are my main results when I do the topic modeling. So I look at the topics and I look to what extent are they foreign or domestic. So are they about a domestic topic or a foreign topic? And for each of the 4 events, I find that in the Netherlands, there's more domestication. So the event is to a larger extent related to the Netherlands, to something that's important in the Netherlands or happening in the Netherlands than in France. So this is my most important finding. And then I go into more detail and wonder how does this work? So what is going on behind these varying degrees of domestication in the two countries? And first of all, if we look at the event in a foreign way, then I see that this happens much more often in France, obviously, if you look at the results. And for instance, I take the case study of the Libyan intervention, which happened during the Arab Spring in 2011, 2012. And then in France, the event is very much seen as a foreign political affair. So, for instance, some French intellectuals were very much applauding or pushing the then President Sarkozy to intervene in Libya. So they wrote an opinion article in Le Monde in which they said we have to intervene and Sarkozy has to take a leading role here. On the other hand, one Dutch intellectual in a newspaper said, we want to play with the big boys, so we want to join, but this is nonsense. The Netherlands has always been a small country, so we should not join this international force to intervene in Libya. So both in this case, in France and the Netherlands, there were debates about joining, but in France, the idea that France should join, that it should do something on the international stage, was much more applauded than in the Netherlands. And this happened with all 4 events. So in all cases, I see that in France, the event is much more seen as a foreign political affair than in the Netherlands. In the Netherlands, it's let's stay modest, let's stay far away from this event.
Thijs, could I
Yes.
interrupt you for 1 second because your slides are not advancing?
My slides are not advancing.
You might have to be in presentation mode. There we go. Thank you.
Yes, like this?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, I'm sorry. Okay, so then when we look at how events get domesticated, this happens much more often in the Netherlands than in France. We see this, for instance, with the elections in the Netherlands in 2002, a few months after 9/11, and then we see that 9/11 gets very much domesticated, so related to discussions about Muslim integration. In the Netherlands, we see the rise of right-wing populist Tim Fortuyn in Dutch politics, and he is claiming that 9/11 has a lot to do with the integration of Muslims in, let's say, Western Europe, including the Netherlands. So he's saying if we go on with the integration process like this, we might have a civil war in our countries at some point. So this is very normal in the Netherlands to claim that international events have something to do with the Dutch national political context. In France, on the other hand, there's also a right-wing populist who is very prominent around this time, but he is hardly making any claims about 9/11. So he's hardly relating 9/11 to French politics, while it would have been very logical or normal or easy for him to do so, but he's not doing that. What is also happening more often in the Netherlands is that events become interconnected with the personal lives of Dutch celebrities. So in both countries, I find that American celebrities are quoted in newspapers to discuss international events. For instance, the Trump election, it's discussed by American celebrities in both the Netherlands and in France. But what happens much more often in the Netherlands than in France is that Dutch celebrities are saying that they suffer from, for instance, the Trump election or the tsunami. So for instance, here a Dutch singer is interconnecting Dutch populism with the Trump election. This is happening a lot actually in the Netherlands, and this is hardly ever happening in France. So these are some of the patterns that I found, and this brings me to the following conclusion.
Before you conclude, I don't want people to miss your slides, and I think it's because you're not in presentation mode, they haven't advanced. So I want to make sure we don't miss out on that visual part.
But I think I am in presentation.
You could also click on the sidebar. There we go. Yeah.
Is this better?
You're still not in presentation, but your slides are advancing. Can you click on the icon on the bottom right, the presentation?
But if I use it like this, can you still see it, even though not clearly? Because if I use my own presentation mode, then I think it's not working.
Try advancing on to the, yes, as long as you're clicking the slides on the left, we should be able to see them. Right.
Is this okay?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So just to repeat shortly, what I see happening much more often in the Netherlands than in France is that Dutch celebrities are discussing international events as if they are very important for their own lives. So their own psyche is influenced by the international events, and this rarely happens in France. So in the Netherlands, I see different types of domestication happening. In France, this happens much less often. So to conclude, I come to 2 different cultural repertoires of relating to the foreign. On the one hand, there's the French grandeur, the aim to franchise world politics. So international events are an opportunity to make the world know about France and to let France intervene in foreign affairs. In the Netherlands, on the other hand, there's a lot of modesty when it comes to intervening in international affairs, but the events get very much domesticated. So they become important for national politics or even the personal lives of some celebrities. So in the end, these are 2 types of nationalism. So both, it's not really about the international event as such, but it's about how can we make this into something we care about or we find important as a nation. And this brings me to the following conclusion regarding foreign events or crisis and social change. So on the one hand, in France, there's an eagerness to change world politics in relation to foreign events, but the foreign does not enter domestic politics. In the Netherlands, there's modesty when it comes to intervention in world politics, but domestic affairs are triggered by the foreign. And then I wonder if this is a more general pattern. I don't know. We should look into this. So we could, for instance, research if big countries are much more inclined to foreignize events, whereas small countries like the Netherlands or Belgium or Luxembourg or any other small country are much more inclined to domesticate foreign events. Okay, I'm sorry that the PowerPoint didn't really work, but something went wrong apparently. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Thijs. And we get the gist of your presentation, no problem.
Good.
Thank you all for these very thought-provoking presentations. My head is spinning at the moment, not sure whether to be pessimistic about the local and community level or optimistic about the power of youth potential for change. So I'll ask one opening question as members of our audience gather their thoughts. I'd like to ask that you put your questions in the Q&A and we'll be happy to respond. And if we don't have any questions immediately, our panelists could also think of questions for each other. But just something that struck me immediately was this boomerang effect of the events and demands that are happening within communities and then cities around the world, then reflecting and swelling to a call for collective action in other locations and on a much larger scale. So the question I have is this something new? Is this due to the interconnectedness that Thijs mentioned that's leading to the protests that we see at the scope that Cécile covered? Or is this replicating a historical pattern that we saw in, say, 1968, 69? So what is new about this moment, if anyone wants to take that on?
Can offer some thoughts?
Thank you.
It's a really intriguing question, and of course very important given the world that we're dealing with right now. I think that, of course, each moment is contingent and specific, but what we're also seeing is a sort of view of the future that's not as positive as it has been at other times. And that, I think, is leading to political action. And so in a peculiar sort of way, I actually think that when people are generally hopeful and when they generally think that their lives will be better, then they're okay with their lives. But when all of a sudden they expect that the future will be different and not so good from what they're seeing right now, that's when they actually go out and engage in political action. And so I think, and certainly, I mean, I don't want to speak for Cécile, but I think in a way that's really what's there, right? This matter of talking about what they're trying to do as life and death, that's really what I think it's telling us. It's that we have a generation and groups of people more broadly who think that the future is untenable, who no longer have that hopefulness that perhaps they used to. And so they're engaging in political action to try to change the structures around them.
Any other views on that before the next question?
Yes, I can just say, yes, I totally agree with Ioana. I think what is specific is the time perspective. Because if you compare, for example, the values of the new waves of youth movements compared to the 68 movements, you can see that they are more anchored at first in the reaction to what is considered a crisis, economic, political, environmental, and to interplay of crisis. And there is this very dark vision of future. And when I see the slogans, it's a lot, much more than in 68. It was more anti-authoritarian, more about values. And here it's a lot about which future? There is like something new about the time and opposing past generations and a struggle for to impose a new vision of future and a more positive vision of future. So there is something anchored in the time perspective we have now.
Thank you. Poulomi, did you want to say
something? To add to it, I mean, there's also a global dimension to these protests, right? In the Western sphere, we are experiencing for the first time that the next generation would actually not be as well off as their parents. And there is a pessimism about it. You see the future as dark, which is quite different from the movements that we are seeing in the global South, right? In places like Africa, in South Asia. Keeping the last couple of years of the pandemic aside, I mean, these countries are experiencing economic growth that they've not in the past many decades, and the youth in these places is quite hopeful. So these protests are also, you know, generating a rhetoric about a better future, but they're less pessimistic about what is to come. And you see that a little bit more in the kinds of topics that get covered by movements as well. I mean, climate change is huge in the West, but not so much in places like China, India, in like Nigeria. And there are two ways of looking at it. You can think about, you know, the youth in these places not caring, but they're also driven very much by their own futures that looks very different from their parents' future, right? So yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thijs, go ahead.
I don't have much to add to these wonderful comments. Maybe I looked at 4 events, and all the events were, let's say, negative events. They were experienced negatively. The Arab Spring in the beginning was experienced positively, but in the end it also was experienced negatively by at least a lot of people around the globe. I wonder if this is an effect of the media, which always look at negative effects or negative events, or if it's a time effect. And if we would, for instance, look at the 90s, which was, I think, a more positive era in many places around the globe, we would find more positive events to look at. I don't know.
Thank you. We have a question from our former colleague, Oya, at Elizabethtown College. So I'll read it and then maybe add one more dimension to it. Oya thanks you for the excellent presentation. And she wonders what the role of social media plays in terms of supporting these social movements and addressing the disparities that were mentioned by at least some of the panelists. And to add on to her question in particular, I am curious if social media has played an equalizing role in India with more equal access to social networks as a way of communication and spreading messages. And also, as you just touched on, Thijs, the role of social media as an alternative to the official media alternatives that you would normally see when reading about events that are foreign.
I can say a word about it. It's a really interesting question. Thank you very much. So about social media, it's quite intriguing because at the beginning of the waves, so at the beginning of last decade with indignation movements and the Occupy movements, a lot of researchers were saying we are in a new era of social movements because of social media, and there are even networked movements. But after a while, with some new research, it appeared that yes, social media has a strong role, especially in the resonance of ideas. And so that's why social movements, at first locally structured and with some specific focus, nationally shaped focus, sometimes can take ideas from another movement, and you have a strong resonance in between the ideas. But the researchers showed that there is, we have to take into account the strong mobility of people and what is really, where are the ideas circulating. A lot of encounters, direct face-to-face encounters with activists going from one social movement to another. And it has been shown that this cosmopolitan activist has really a strong role also in the social movement. So it's not only social media, it's also the strong mobility of activists now that can explain the cross-national diffusion of ideas and tactics and repertoire of actions.
Thank you. Any other thoughts on that, on social media?
Yes, I think this is a very interesting question related to my presentation, because I look at national media, of course, and the thing with national media is that they have to attract a national audience. So maybe if we would look at social media, the results that I got would be very different, and there would be more similarities, let's say, between French and Dutch social media users, because they are all relating to the same global events, and they don't really have to care about inviting a national audience to care. So I think it would be really interesting to, let's say, test the domestication of foreign events on social media. But I don't know what would be the result of such a research.
Thank you. Poulomi, before you answer, I might throw one more question at you to go along with it, which is a question from Yossi Harpas, another former colleague in the Weatherhead Scholars Program, who asks, do you see the dignity dominance axis as changing in importance over time? For example, becoming more powerful in recent years? Do you see these status struggles as preceding or following those over economic redistribution?
Thanks. So I'll start with the first question about social media. And this again is very interesting because who has access to social media is quite important. And in many countries, people with access are people who are, in the middle class or upper middle class. And they are not always in support of movements that are more democratic in some ways. And this is where, fake news and fake the role of social media in spreading wrong discourse comes in, right? And this is something that we know of mostly anecdotally and through journalistic understanding, but as a form of it's still a very new body of research, and there are people studying how some of this just relates to a psychological understanding of these reports basically confirming our preconceived notions and beliefs. And then there's also in some ways it's very democratizing because you don't need the kind of resources that one would have needed to organize, right? And the second question from Yossi, that's a really interesting question. I think that, it always goes back and forth, the movements by marginal groups and the backlash movements by the elite. There's always a struggle between the two. And the moment that we are in now, historically and globally, we feel like, movements by the elite, backlash politics is something that's been on the rise everywhere. Right, and we call it populism. We call it, say, the rise of Trump or the rise of Modi. Similar stories in Brazil. But what is interesting is that, what are the structural conditions under which marginal groups are able to organize? And this has generally been the case that once a middle class emerges among marginal groups, they finally have the resources, the time, as well as the networks to be able to organize, right? It's not simply enough to have the demographic strength, even when you have universal franchise. So in cases like, say, Bolivia, for example, marginal groups were very much part of the left for decades. And it's only after a significant middle class emerged in those groups that they started organizing and forming their own parties. It was very similar in the case of lower caste movements in India as well. So so I don't have a very good answer. I don't know if they've like become stronger over time as an ideological movement, but in terms of some of the structural conditions that have changed over time does support movements on the left more than it used to a few decades ago.
Thank you. So we have just a couple minutes left, and I'll take this last question we received from a colleague as a good way to end. And you could choose if you'd like to end on an optimistic or pessimistic note. The question is, do you have any examples or specifics about how your findings could be applied to affect specific change? And so I interpret that as, is there hope? Is there anything that you've discovered that will bring change in the future?
I can start. For me, yes, I have hope, even if I'm studying not only what I spoke of today, so the revolts and the social movements, but I'm also working on more silent angers among more precarious young people. And I try to connect my research findings to make some propositions about youth policies and generational policies in some societies, especially in Canada and France. And for me, what I can feel, even if the energy is the one of despair at first, but I can feel there is more and more the feeling, because of this time perspective of decline, of danger maybe, but that we have nothing to lose. And I can feel throughout the decade and now in the new, in the life courses of young people, that there is it's not only anti-systemic, it's about the change must be in our lives. And so there is, maybe because of the pandemic, we could see the policies at stake. Maybe I think there is a very quick politicization, even in young generation. If we put in place some very good youth policies, yes, there is hope.
Thank you, Cécile. Any other thoughts in our final minutes? Poulomi?
I'm very hopeful. I mean, compare the world today to how it was, say, 50 years ago or 100 years ago. It is more democratic, right? I mean, look at how just the legislatures are in different countries, and you see more women in positions of power. You see more people from low status, from marginal groups in positions of power. It's not enough. It's nothing close to how we would like it to be. And of course, climate change and environmental problems, that makes you wonder if there would even be a world in a couple of 100 years. But I'm very hopeful about the future, because if you take a longer view of things, we are moving towards greater equality.
Thank you. I'm going to end us here, since that's such a positive note, and we're at 1:15. So I want to thank all of you, Ioana, Poulomi, Taj, and Cécile, for your time and your work, and for being such a wonderful addition to the Weatherhead Scholars Program. And thank you to everyone who attended today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.